So, Barbara Hunt, welcome back. You're the first person I've interviewed twice.
Oh, cool.
And today we are going to be talking about forgiveness, because you've written the book on forgiveness. You're gonna get it. There we go. Forgiveness Made Easy: The Revolutionary Guide to Moving Beyond Your Past and Truly Letting Go, by Barbara J. Hunt. And how long's the book been out?
I published it in 2017, so this is the third winter. So this time of year it came out.
Yeah. And what's that? Is this is your first book that you've written?
Yes.
So what? Just before we get into the subject of the book, I mean, how was it writing a book?
It was really interesting because I signed up for a book coach to help me do it. And it was a very intense program for about 90 days. So the idea was to write your first draft in that 90 days. And it was quite expensive. So I crowdfunded them to get the money to actually pay for the book coach, which was great because it meant I also had the momentum of lots of people who I cared about and who cared about me on sort of like in the background. So it really helped me to actually do it. And so the first draft was, that was interesting and very poor. But I'd also been told by a friend of mine whose husband is a very successful writer to write a very bad first draft. So I did write a very bad first draft. And then I renamed the book, wrote the whole thing again with a different lens, which was the trouble with forgiveness, because I was really interested in why we find it so hard. And then realized that wasn't going to sell either. And so then I rewrote the whole thing again and called it Forgiveness Made Easy.
And who was helping you edit the book?
So again, my very good friend who remained anonymous, CD, so she helped me edit it. But I did have lots of other early readers. I had 5 early readers, my son included, and they were all giving me feedback on what was working, what wasn't. And then when they'd given me feedback, I would then edit as far as I could go myself and then send it to my friend who is an excellent editor. And we had a vision that it would be the go-to book. Like any time you want to know something about forgiveness, this is your handbook. This explains, what it is, what it isn't, how you do it, what gets in the way. And it's really, because forgiveness seems like a mystery, and often it's connected with the spiritual world or with religious teachings. I was wanting to help to undo where it was connected. And I do still think that it is an incredibly profound spiritual practice, right up there with meditation. I think actually what forgiveness asks of us is probably, and in fact, you said this, and I quote you in my book, Ralph, that it's a synthesis or a distillation of all spiritual teachings, the act of forgiveness, because it's an internal maneuver that we don't. It's almost like we don't even know how we're doing it. Maybe when you're first learning maybe a martial art or even yoga or Pilates, something like that, and someone's telling you to move something and you're like, I don't even know how I move that thing inside of me. And I think it's the same thing with forgiveness. We're being required to let go of something that we don't even usually know that we're holding on to or why we're holding on to it.
Yeah, I think what it makes me think is it orients your approach to life so that life's not a problem anymore. It can be difficult, it could be horrendous, but if your default position is one of forgiving life for being so dark, painful, cruel and miserable, as well as all the all the good things, but that's a fundamental shift in your orientation to life, and so many people are stuck in, well, they have a relationship with their own life or life in general that's kind of like a dysfunctional personal relationship, one with the lack of trust and petty arguments and bickering over little things and forgetting the wood for the trees and all of those things that we do in normal human to human relationships. We kind of repeat that on a larger scale. So for me, I kind of, that's when I was thinking of it as being like this master practice, a universal practice that all of these plug into. I think that is a very important base layer to then build a life upon, or practices. You know, it's like a kind of foundation, and it's a massive thing. So it's a simple idea, but it's very difficult to do, and it's one that you imagine keep coming back to.
Yeah. And it's really funny. It's such a fascinating thing. It's almost like the more I've thought about it and the more I've had conversations with people and the more I've been interviewed. And I prepared a presentation for the Integral Relationship Facilitators group recently. And that was fascinating because I put forgiveness through an integral lens. So to look at what parts of the whole does it involve, and it was very illuminating to do that. But I think I like what you're saying about the foundation of it, because I think when we think about forgiveness and the things that are to be forgiven, it's usually something that is not the way we want it to be. And so if you imagine sort of life is like this, and then as soon as it diverges from how we want it to be, that's really where we get a grudge or a grievance or a gripe or something even greater, like, you know, serious revenge or hatred or vendettas or war. But it's like, it's as soon as something or someone is different from the way we want it to be, there's a gap. And so what we know, when you're talking about the spiritual path, you're talking about aligning with life the way it is. And even wanting it to be different has a kind of a gap, and the gap is where our suffering is, and the bigger the gap, the bigger our suffering.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of this distinction between pain and suffering, that pain is an unavoidable aspect of life,
Yes.
but suffering is optional. Might not be the right word, because, you know, we're so conditioned to suffer. But you know, with if you bring online very determined will and all of these other things, that you can actually choose. I mean, choose is a very strong word here, but you could choose to not suffer in life by taking very seriously a practice like forgiveness, one of these all-encompassing ones. So you're still feeling pain like any living creature, but that suffering is kind of in the field of what that problematic relationship with life and God, nature, goddess, whatever, you know, that wider context.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. As soon as we start arguing with reality or the way people are, that's when we start suffering. And I agree, there is pain, there is. And a lot of, I think when you look at the world in general, a lot of the suffering that people experience is optional, as in we could do things differently. And some of it's about how we think, and some of it, like you said, it's a cultural expectancy or acceptance, or just a norm that we haven't questioned. And there's so many assumptions that we don't question.
No, and I think that you know, this integral perspective on it, that there's an individual level of forgiveness, then there's a kind of a cultural element to forgiveness. It's sort of you know, that kind of intersubjective culture that we're all swimming in, that influences the way we behave and relate to one another. And then we've got the actual institutions that are enshrined in law, and the infrastructure, even down to architect. You know, what do we live in a forgiving architectural environment? You know, or can we forgive our inner city ugliness or whatever? You know, it's that we quite, when you think of a lot of conflicts that forgiveness would be the solution, quite often people want the forgiveness to only happen on one of these levels. Like, are ethnic group needs to, we want your ethnic group to forgive us. And, you know, that might happen on an individual level when people meet face to face, but then there's all sorts of geographic things which locate your tribes, and your ethnic groups might be blended together in really uncomfortable ways because of the town planning and those sort of things. And then there's all sorts of cultural history that then, and really to work on it in a way that's going to be most effective is to take this broader perspective and not geek out on one of these. Does that make any sense? So
it does,
struggling to get that out in an articulate way.
No, it does make sense. But interestingly, when I did look through the integral lens, ultimately you do end up in the upper left quadrant, which is the interior of the individual, because if you, even 100-year war, the people who are doing the warring 100 years later must have been taught it by the people who came before them, because it's like we learn our hatreds, we learn our prejudices, and we learn to forgive. And so in some ways, although it plays out, and there may be, like you said, the blending of different cultures in one particular geographic area, the resentment, if somebody said, go and find me the resentment and I want you to clear it up off the pavement, you can't. It's an invisible thing. It isn't actually in the physical realm at all.
So much of it would be an oral tradition, passed down, you know, like stories of.
Exactly. There's no physical element to it, and I think that's one of the things, because my particular fascination about forgiveness is why we don't do it. Because I think there's a lot of assumptions and there's a lot of spiritual teachings out there about how amazing it is. And there's even scientific proof about how it improves your stress, you know, lowers your stress levels, you know, lowers your cortisol, improves your overall well-being, even improves your immune system, which right now is a really good thing. And that's like Ken Wilber was lauding its virtues recently on a talk that he did about how important forgiveness is as a spiritual practice. And but so I'm fascinated, why don't we do it? If something is that amazing, why don't we? And you could argue there's lots of, you know, evidence of human stupidity in the way we live our lives and the risks we take and the foods we eat and the recreational drugs we take, and, you know, there's lots of things that we do that aren't good for us. And forgiveness is an extraordinary potential for transformation, not just for the individual, but in relationships. So you go like inside your own heart, you feel differently. It transforms the relationships that you have. It also transforms the culture that you're living in, and potentially could transform the world. But the actual work of forgiveness, the letting go, is inside each heart. And that's one of the things why it's hard, is because you can't see it. It's not something that you can have evidence of. And I did, when I was doing my presentation for the Integral People, I was looking on the internet for images of forgiveness. And of course, there aren't any. There's hands being held out with the word forgiveness on stones, or, you know, there's kind of like doves and, you know, leaves falling, but you can't see forgiveness. And I think that's one of the reasons we struggle with it so much, is it's a concept, probably a bit like meditation or mindfulness, that you can't see it. And so we find it hard to do. You know, if you can't imagine it, it's a hard thing for us to actually achieve.
So your book helps kind of lay out, well, give shape to forgiveness, so people can actually get some kind of purchase on it.
Yeah. So it does several things. One of the things is it talks about what forgiveness is. So, and I use a really specific definition in my book, which is forgiveness is the absolute refusal to hold ill will against someone or something for what they did or didn't do. So I'll say it again because it's quite wordy. So it's the absolute refusal to hold ill will against someone or something for what they did or didn't do. And so if you think of it like you're holding on to something, if this is a rope and you're on the end of the rope, you would know for sure if I'd let go, because you'd be winding down the mountain at great speed. So you know you've let it go when you actually choose to. And so that's why I like the definition. It comes from K. Bradford Brown, who was one of my early teachers. And And he also talks about resentment, because resentment is ill will held over time for good reason, and that's the bit that often we don't understand. We don't know what we're holding on to, and so I like to think of there's a spectrum of resentment. So you've got resentment in the middle, and then you've kind of got grudges, grievances, gripes, just wanting things to be a bit different, just being a bit, nitpicky with your spouse or whatever, right through to, on the other end of resentment, is vendettas and war and everything that doesn't get forgiven and that people think is unforgivable. I mean, there are people who would say certain acts are unforgivable. And in my book, because you're the one who's choosing to hold on or to let go, then it doesn't actually matter what the grievance is. And interestingly, I mean, I get this a lot because I work on a retreat. And so we work sometimes with groups of people. So I'd be working one-to-one with maybe like 20 different people in a week. And sometimes the people who have been abused sexually or emotionally or mentally or physically as children, or have experienced extreme trauma, find it easier to forgive than people who have a difficult husband or wife, or just like a brother who was a bit spoiled more than they were. It's absolutely fascinating that the thing is not the thing about whether or not you can forgive it. It's not dependent on whether or not it's this pencil or this pen.
Yeah. So that runs against our intuition.
Yeah.
So what you must have drawn some kind of conclusion or about that.
Well, I mean,
why?
what's fascinating is that some of it is to do with what you make it mean. So that's kind of back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. It's our interpretation of things, the meaning that we give things, that creates the suffering. So that's in there as well. So it's not just the event is not the way we want it to be. If somebody says something, because one of the people I was remembering who've had real difficulty forgiving, a family member said something really unkind at a wedding. And she was like, I can't ever forgive them for that. I'm not going to ever forgive them. That was unacceptable. And just one other thing to say about forgiveness and resentment is that there's a really good book by, I can't remember his name right now, Michael E. McCulloch, and about the forgiveness instinct. And so he argues that we have an instinct for revenge that was programmed in us when we were creating our very early societies, to say this is acceptable behavior and that is unacceptable behavior. And if you do that to my daughter, then there will be consequences to your daughter or another family member. That you can kind of understand how there was a way of those kinds of things would create a social cohesion of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in terms of behavior. But he also argues at the same time is that we have an instinct for forgiveness because, again, we're living in communities, or way back then we were, and some of us lucky enough to be doing that now. So people are able to, it's almost like we need to be able to forgive. We need to be able to put our shield of grievance down. We need to be able to let go when we need to, in order to maintain our societies. So it's very interesting. They're both in there.
It would be a matter of minutes before each society fell apart if we couldn't or family, if you just literally couldn't forgive.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's so we're making a distinction here between behavior that really is deserves some kind of punishment or repercussions, that behavior that is, it's not, so it's bad behavior basically. And we don't want that in our families, in ourselves, in our society. The forgiveness is something slightly different than that. So someone might say, oh right, so you're saying you should just forgive everybody and there's no such thing as a bad action and there should be no consequences for people that, for example, murder somebody, or that's not what you're saying.
That's not
I
what
imagine.
I'm saying. Yeah.
So people must come back at you with that.
Yeah.
And what's your answer to that?
And I think that's another reason why we're afraid to forgive, It's because we think that's what it means. We think so. Along with what forgiveness is and that very clear definition, I also talk about what forgiveness isn't. And it isn't letting people off the hook. It's not saying things are okay when they're not okay. It's not about not pursuing restorative justice. You would pursue restorative justice if it was appropriate. You would divorce your spouse if they were violent and unkind. And, it's like, it's not, about being a doormat. It's just saying that I can go through the courts holding on to my resentment and hating my partner and screw them for as much money as I can get out of them. Or I can consciously uncouple. I can see it's the end of our relationship. We're not going to be able to go on any further. We've got kids between us. How do we negotiate that works for the whole family? And I don't have to hate my partner in the process. I don't have to hold the resentment. I can do it like that, or I can do it like that. And that's basically the choice that we always have. And it's true. And it doesn't mean that you wouldn't, incarcerate people if necessary, if they're violent and uncontrollable, or do rehabilitation programs for people who want to do that. So it's not about not taking any action. It's about choosing to not hold the ill will, so that you can then see clearly in order to know what the next action is.
I think there's a sort of a power that you have as an individual. It's like the last power you have as an individual to actually do that act of forgiveness. So let's say somebody murdered your child, and it was completely out of your control. There's nothing you could do about that situation. And it's obviously an awful situation. And, you'd hope that that person would be brought to justice, imprisoned probably for the rest of their life or whatever. And no one can ever bring back your child, and that leaves a hole in your heart forever. So all of that's kind of out of your control. But the one thing you can actually decide to do, and that you actually have power over, is whether you can let go of that in a manner of forgiveness in your own heart.
Yeah.
I think probably for me, for the sake of your own self-love and the love of life, perhaps, or something, that the inability to forgive is toxic, and it literally kills people.
Yeah.
And it also toxifies the culture and society. It is it's a poison.
Yeah.
And it's up to you, and it's whether you're going to pump more of that into the system.
Yeah.
And it's a big move. I mean, I'm not saying it's a little thing. It's a big move, but I think that's why the word power comes to me, because it's a very powerful move to make. And there's lots of examples of people making that move. They're in the newspapers, that we read about. And I think perhaps from a sort of spiritual perspective, there are Tibetan Buddhist monks and nuns that have been tortured in jails under the Communist Chinese Party, and because they are devout, long-term spiritual practitioners, and they've had these deep religious beliefs in in that tradition, that they've really have been through hell, in dungeons, torture dungeons, just like the worst thing that life serves up to people. And even having gone through that, they are not lying or bullshitting us or pretending to be pious or anything like that. They actually genuinely have said, and they mean it, they forgive the people that have done that to them.
Yeah.
And that, it kind of puts hairs on the back of my neck just thinking about that. So yeah.
And it is extraordinary. And like I was saying before, it's not necessarily any correlation between the severity of the act that you're forgiving and your ability to do it.
Yeah.
And those are extreme circumstances. And I think sometimes when we have those kinds of exemplars, we feel very ashamed of
Yes.
our own inability to forgive our spouse who repeatedly will not put the lid back on
Yeah.
the toothpaste, or, you know, whatever the little grievances. And again, that's partly, again, the approach of my book, which is to normalize the need for forgiveness. Like, it's not something that you only need if you've been tortured. It's something that you need every single day of your life, because you are holding grudges and grievances against pretty much everyone you've ever met. And, you know, I'm speaking from personal experience, because when you really think about it, a lot of the time we do want things to be different from the way they are. And there's that great alternative serenity prayer, which is, grant me the serenity to accept the people I cannot change, the courage to change the one I can, and the wisdom to know that it's me. And we always want other people to be different from the way they are. And almost the definition of a resentment is, if you were different, I'd be happy. Why won't you just be more like how I want you to be, rather than the way you are? And so that is why it's a spiritual practice, because you're constantly trying to come back to reality the way it is, rather than the way you wish it was.
Yeah.
And you're living in like an ungrounded state of wishing things were different, rather than with the reality of the way things are. And then there still are conversations that you need to have, where you can say, what will it take? How can I help you to put the lid back on the toothpaste every evening? You know, what will it take? So, you know, there may be conversations that need to be had. And I know it sounds really trivial, and maybe that's too trivial, but I think my invitation always is that we take care of our own hearts, and we take care of the grudges and grievances that are in our own hearts. And they can be historical if we haven't done our forgiveness work. So it can be going right back to our parents. And then this is where more of the obstacles show up, because a lot of people will go, oh, well, I don't resent them. I just, you know, I'm just disappointed, which basically says they weren't the way I want them to be. But even that, you know, when we recognize that our parents were probably doing the best they could with what they had, it's still not quite the same as forgiveness. And I met with somebody the other day who said, oh, no, I didn't meet them. I was listening to them on the radio, and they were talking about this girl at school that had bullied them. And she said, well, I've got nothing to do with her anymore. I'm not, you know, she's not in my life. So, you know, I don't even think about her. I don't think about her. So that isn't forgiveness. And when she was kind of asked by the interviewer, there was something about, or is there a school reunion or something? Would you go? And she was like, oh no, there's a school reunion. I'm not going. So even though she thinks that this woman isn't in her life anymore, her resentment is still in her body. Like you were saying about poison, there's some other great quotes about resentment is like setting yourself on fire and hoping the smoke will bother the other person. Resentment is like taking poison and hoping the other person will die. I mean, it really is. It's all inside you, all of the bad feeling. And resentment comes from the origins of resentir, from the Latin, which means to feel again. So you're feeling again the anger, feeling again the wishing it was different, feeling again that, you know, how, you know, why are they the way they are, and why aren't they the way I want them to be?
When you say, oh yeah, I forgive my parents or whatever because they were just doing the best they could, or or that person bullied me at school because, you know, they had a rough time at home. That's working on the level of your mind and logic. But then the type of forgiveness really we're talking about here happens at the level of our hearts. You know, it's an emotional, it's almost like right at the core of our sense of identity or something. It's extremely deep gesture. Makes you think of the Indian, the Sanskrit words that pops up a lot in the Indian traditions and Tibetan Buddhism and stuff. A mudra. It's an internal sort of subtle, on a subtle level. You know, a gesture. Your actual orientation, as I was saying before, and we could probably all sit around and use our brains to figure out why we forgive these people, blah blah blah, they were doing whatever the best, they blah blah blah. But you've got to take it down to the level of your heart really to do this work. And perhaps there's the gut is the other level, and I don't know how that features in. It's not something I've thought about, but I don't know whether you have. Do we need
Yeah.
to go into our our
Well,
guts?
actually, I think we do. I mean, when I work one to one with people, so there's two things. One is I in my book I've created a forgiveness made easy process, which is like what you're describing, a mudra. It's a ceremonial act of forgiveness where you are consciously choosing to let go. And it is a bit like, because I come from the Catholic tradition. I was brought up as a Catholic. And so there are what's called sacraments in the tradition. And so each one of these things, so like the sacrament of confession or communion or marriage or the last rites, they're these different points in your life. So they are a bit like the transition, the ritual transition from one stage in life to another, which is one of the things that we've lost culturally. We don't celebrate like the first blood for girls or boys, becoming men. There's that sense of, we don't have those rituals that mark those important, significant events. And so the way I set forgiveness up is to make it a significant event. And if you work with me one to one, it takes about 90 minutes if we're going to really like genuinely forgive somebody for something, particularly something that was difficult, or childhood abuse, or just a challenging childhood. Because sometimes, even just the birth of your little brother, or, parents moving house or going to boarding school or whatever it is, they can be significant events that need attention. And although you might not necessarily immediately think, well, I don't need to forgive myself or my parents for sending me to boarding school, but maybe you do, because there may be a wish in the very younger you that wished it was different. You might not have been consulted. Often children are told, oh, you're going to go to boarding school. There's no kind of consultation sense. Or if you're moving house, there's like, well, we're moving, and the kid is going, yeah, but my best friend lives around the corner. And there's no sort of sense of negotiation, because always the adults know better. And so in some ways, the forgiveness ritual that I do with people is like a shamanic soul retrieval, where you're allowing the younger aspects of you to also be integrated and to say what wasn't okay. Because the rational adult us is going, well, I understand they had to move, dad's job changed, so of course that blah blah blah. So we can rationalize it. But
That's also a defense against going deeper into the emotional pain of it.
Exactly.
It's a way of doing fake forgiveness, perhaps, or something.
Yeah, exactly, because we don't want to feel the pain. And so one of the other things I do in the forgiveness book is look at, why don't we want to let go of our resentment? And there are very subtle interior things that are going on that mean that it's easier, just like you said, it's easier to hold this as my resentment than it is for me to expose my heart and to feel the pain or the grief of the things I didn't get, or the things that happened to me. This is so much more palatable. We would rather carry our resentment around, even though it's heavy and toxic. We want that more than we want to actually have an open-hearted, vulnerable relationship with life.
Yeah, I think maybe that it gives you a perverse feeling of being in power, that I've got something here, my resentment.
Exactly.
I'm in a powerful position now because I hate you, and But it's as we were discussing earlier, it's that sense of power is actually an illusion. There, the real act of power is to forgive deep in your heart.
Yeah, and Brad Brown says resentment is the power of the powerless. So when you've got nothing, this feels like something.
Yeah,
just like you're saying.
One thing that I'm thinking is, so I mean, this might be your personal bias towards the individual level of things, but I'm thinking about, say, Black Lives Matter and some of these cultural movements that they're pushing for collective action. So it's not like, well, each in our individual lives we need to make this forgiveness. They're saying we want this to be a law for this type of so there's this kind of the polarity of the individual level of working at things and then the collective. And you've talked quite a lot about the individual level. What about this collective level, and what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on it?
That's a great question. The thing is, I do agree that laws need to be changed. I mean, we need to have equality, regardless of whether, between men and women, all genders, races, creeds, everything.
Mm.
But when you make it cultural, it's out there. They
Yeah.
should be different. If and you could change the law, and no one forgive anyone.
Yeah.
And that, I think that's the trouble, is that it looks like, oh yeah, I'm all for Black Lives Matter and blah blah blah, but I hate my fucking husband.
Mm.
But do you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
and then so you still got resentment. It's just, maybe I don't hate those people, but I still have resentment. And so the reason why I always bang on about it being the responsibility of the individual is because it is. And we're all interconnected. And so if I do my forgiveness work and my heart is much more available and open, I'm much nicer to everybody I meet. I'm more available. It doesn't just improve my, love life or the people that I'm connected to. There's something different energetically. And the really weird thing about forgiveness is there is an energetic part to it, and I can't explain it, and it sounds woo-woo, and yeah, I've got long hair and I look like a hippie, but it's like there's something very important that happens. And I've witnessed this a lot of times when I've been on the retreat. So for example, there's one really good example. This woman did some forgiveness work on her mother, and then she came up to me a couple of days later and she went, "You'll never guess what? My mother phoned me out of the blue and told me she loved me. And she has never done that in my whole life." I mean, those kinds of things. Or, you do your forgiveness work and then you have a really sweet connection with somebody, or they'll text you, and they haven't been in contact, or, that kind of thing. That happens all the time. So in some ways, your individual work is for the collective, because we're all interconnected.
Yeah. With that, there's a whole rabbit hole. I'm not even going to touch that one, because it might take us away. It might take us away from the matter, the subject. But I think, again, it's one of the insights that I've picked up from Ken Wilber and this integral stuff is the importance of first, second, and third person perspectives, and that they're all as valid as each other and important. And to really make change happen, you've got to include all of those. And so, the legal stuff, laws, that's a third person thing. And as you rightly point out, if that's the only way you're going to try and tackle it, then it's always out there. It's a third person thing. And then, you're bringing in this first person and second person perspectives to kind of balance it all out. And I think we can't all be experts in the first, second, and third person versions of this. You're obviously an expert on working on an individual level with this, and then there are other people which know a lot about law. They might have studied law at university and civil rights and those kind of things, and they'd be in a better position to work on that third person level. I think one thing that's important to point out is that people is what's really great is when people recognize the validity of first, second, and third person perspectives. So let's just say there's someone working on the law side of things and civil rights law, that they don't think, well, this is the most important thing. They're saying, okay, what I'm doing, it's my natural bias, my conditioning has made me apt for working on this level. And then there's this person, Barbara, over here working on a more individual level. What she's doing is really great and important, and it meshes with what I'm doing. But so often we get this kind of thing where people who have a bias towards the first person stuff say, oh, they're wasting their time with whatever, and vice versa.
No, I would say all of it, do all of it.
And
also in the process itself, you do go from a first person perspective where you're speaking as the I, to switching shoes with the person you're speaking to. So you're taking the second person, you're taking the other person's view, and then you're doing what William Ury, the peace negotiator, calls going to the balcony. So you're trying to get almost like a third person perspective of the dynamic as well. But I totally agree that we do need to be legislating at the same time. I mean, and also we can't really wait. And we do need to be doing our forgiveness work individually and collectively, because Thomas Hubel does amazing trauma release, collective trauma work, which is really important, especially for certain cultures where they are holding a lot of obvious trauma. And that's another amazing piece of work, but it is different. And so, like you said, my particular speciality is working one-to-one with people, and but the principles are the same. The principles of forgiveness and why you would want to be doing that work are the same. And I think the resistances to it are the same. And even when you're legislating, I think there's that sense of outrage of you don't want to let people off the hook. And I think, when you get to countries and cultures, and when there is resentment, how do you resolve that without also there being legislation and collective work and individual work? I think it does have to happen on all levels.
What are your thoughts on the differences between different religions and forgiveness as a part of them? So when I think of Catholicism, they've got confession, and in the wider context of Christianity, Jesus forgiving our sins and all of that stuff. I'm not aware of it that much in the stuff I've encountered with the Indian traditions and Tibetan and Zen and those sort of things. Forgiveness doesn't seem to be quite as prominent as it is in the Abrahamic religions. I don't know whether that's just because I haven't been looking hard enough, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know, because I can only speak from my personal experience of my upbringing and then my spiritual inquiry since then, which has been into Sufism and then into evolutionary spirituality. So in some ways, I can't really speak, but in very general terms, the reason I'm glad for my Christian upbringing is because Jesus was a master teacher of forgiveness. And when he was asked, how many times should I forgive my brother? He said 70 times 7. He didn't go, oh, only once, or, oh, but not those things. Don't forgive those things. He really was expecting us to have it as a master practice. So every single time that you need to forgive, you need to forgive. And I quite like the other thing about taking the log out of your own eye so that you can see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's. That sort of, again, the sense of self, like you need to do your work. And maybe that has informed what I've written and my particular approach to forgiveness. But what I find really encouraging, the Dalai Lama talks about forgiveness as a secular ethics practice, which I really like. And I wrote my book as a secular ethics book, so I didn't make it spiritual. And I think actually there are some spiritual teachings, particularly in the more new age spiritual religions or spiritual teachings, that actually make forgiveness harder to do, because there's this sense of, well, ultimately there's nothing to forgive because nothing happened. And you chose to have that experience. Your soul chose to have that experience. And when you're talking about childhood abuse, I just find that really hard for people who wanted. It's almost like the child that suffered needs some kind of care and attention and integration. And we don't know about karma. We don't know what we were choosing, whether we chose. All we have is the reality of the trauma that was caused, and then whether or not you let that inform the way you live the rest of your life, whether you carry the resentment about it or whether you find a way to heal it. And so I always want to be really honoring of the trauma and people being a victim. There's a lot of sort of like anti-victim, like you're not a victim of your circumstances. Actually, sometimes people are a victim of their circumstances, and sometimes shit happens to good people. Our cultural bias in our incredible privilege makes it easy for us to say things like that you're choosing, your soul, blah, 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 blah. And that's as far as I'm concerned, a big fat don't know. And so you want to just honor the reality of the person and work from that point of view. And then also just in terms of other religious approaches, I was contacted. In fact, I had a really lovely review by a Muslim imam saying, this is the best book that I've read about forgiveness. And I was having real problems with my supervisor. And I've only read the first 83 pages, but I think it's brilliant. And, you know, I thoroughly recommend it, which was wonderful. And especially because it was applicable in another religious culture, which was my intention. And as far as I understand it, in Judaism, there's I think is one of the religious, I can't remember the name of it now. It is all about forgiveness. I think it might be Yom Kippur, is a forgiveness day, a sacred day. So, yeah.
Well, I like what you're saying about it, the secular ethics thing, because that something that makes sense on that level can be plugged into any worldview, really. And when you talk about being out of alignment with reality, that's a kind of secular way of describing so like life not being the way you want it. Is the religious way, you might say, that is you haven't surrendered to the will of the divine. You know, some divine entity wants this life to be the way it is. It's God's will, or the goddess's will, or the unnameable genderless supreme entity. But then you could say that with equal power, I think, by saying reality is the way it is, and if you want it to be different, that's going to be a painful life, because you're constantly going uphill. And I think at the same time, you know, so I'm thinking what people might say in response to that. So I think we're also I'm assuming you're not saying don't ever try and make your life better. You know, so there's a kind of surrendering to reality as it is, and then there's that kind of, you might call the evolutionary imperative urge to make life more good, more true, and more beautiful. So how does that kind of mesh in with all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's like, because reality is the way it is. So it's kind of just saying, you know, green is green, but it's like, if you want to make green go blue, you have to add a different color to it, you know, or you have to, you know, it's a completely different color actually, but do you know what I mean? It's almost like it's like starting from where we are and going, yeah, this has happened. This is my current reality. But now, as an evolutionary, what's my choice going forward? What do I want to do differently next time? What do I want to, what's the direction of my next step? That is definitely in our power to choose, and towards what's better, you know, what is more true, good, true, and beautiful, for sure.
So in that stance, you're co-creating reality. So, you know, you're a participant in shaping the next moment with as life itself, you know, as but also as an individual. So, you know, I'm thinking there's a sort of more passive thing where it's just reality is just there, and you've just got to lie back and take it, you know, as if you're some kind of you're not really part of the picture, you know, whereas in this evolutionary spirituality, conscious co-creating perspective, you know, you're more of an active agent in collaboration with nature, evolution, the divine will, whatever.
Yeah. I think what we're talking about is the response, isn't it? It's like it's the call. So this is life being whatever it's being, and then it's what's our response to that. And it can be in alignment with, you know, the divine, or, you know, a higher aspiration, however you want to express it. And I think it's forgiveness comes in because it's a place of being free. It really is that, like, reconciling what has happened and choosing to not carry it with you. So it is like that, and in that way, it is like a spiritual mudra, or like a way of being in the world, where you are not tethered to the past by your resentment or by wishing it was different, which is the same thing really. And you are freely available to meet the needs of the moment without any baggage from the past, ideally. So and in some ways that is where you become very powerful, because if you haven't got the resentment dragging you back, you're free to respond in a 360-degree way, which may mean you help to change the law.
Well, for increased freedoms, increased personal freedom is always a good selling point for a secular society, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was thinking how, through meditation practice, one of the things that is classically realized through that is that half of our identity or whatever is this formless awareness, which it has a completely unproblematic relationship with this moment as it is. And it's in the nature of that part of yourself to not forgive this moment for being what it is. It's a completely alien, well, it's a concept for a start, so it's alien to formless awareness because there's no concepts there. But when you start to meditate and you build up a deeper relationship with that part of yourself, and again, I'm not saying that's the only part of who you are. There's loads more to the picture, but it's an aspect of ourselves which most people don't build up a relationship with because they haven't done meditation or whatever. That forgiveness actually is our identity. It is our nature at that level, without any effort on our part. Because this formless awareness part of ourselves, one of the signatures of that is effortlessness. And so I think once, for me, building a deeper relationship with that part of who I am it's always it's a humbling experience, because all of that stuff's already done. It's the very nature of who I am at that level. But there's a kind of a transpersonal level to it too, which is why it's so awe-inspiring that there is this part of yourself which is so at home with this moment.
And you're right, because that is the part that doesn't need to do any forgiveness work, because it hasn't ever held any resentment, because it's eternally free. But I don't think very many of us actually live 100% of the time out of that part of us.
But I think that
old material that
the
ego is still.
Well, yeah, but I mean, so that part of ourselves has no ego, and there's an effortlessness to that part. This is all done already there at that level, and then on the sort of level of form and our egos and personality, that is hard. That's hard work there, and that's kind of probably where most of, well, I don't know, should most of your focus be at that level? I mean, where?
Well, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, I do believe in doing whenever you need to do your forgiveness work, that you do it, but it's so that you can return to your attention being on that other part of you, so that you get free. It's not in order to do more forgiveness work. It's not, a perpetual fascination, because I think that can be one of the things that happens with the ego, is it's so fascinated by itself that it likes to tell its stories over and over and over and over and over and over, which is why you can be in therapy for 30 years and never forgive anyone.
I just had an image of a film I saw, and I think it was Ralph Fiennes was the actor, and he was some absolutely horrendous person in this film, and you got this thing where someone said, "Oh, you could forgive people," and he was just going around and go, "Oh, I forgive you." I think he was some kind of like, oh God, I don't know. I think he might have been. I need to look it up. I'm going to go out there on a limb and say it was a film about the war, maybe he was an officer, some Nazi officer, and he was just forgiving people. And he, you know, normally he'd just kill people, but he'd get into this thing where he'd be like, "Oh, I forgive you. I forgive you," and then he'd be feeling really good about it. But it was just utterly perverse and disgusting that he was forgiving people from this place. It's like a caricature of the worst part of our egos,
Right.
hijacking this thing. You know,
Right. Interesting.
oh, I forgive that person.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
And that I think that's another place where forgiveness gets misused or misunderstood, is that sense of condescending, you know, like I, from my lofty heights of, you know, having judged you, have decided to let you off the hook. That's the sort of, that's one of the forgiveness definitions that I'm not talking about. It's not about that. It's not about.
But there's a lot of that out there, you know, and I mean, I've noticed myself do that many times in my life, you know, where I feel like I'm trying to climb back on top. It's an act of dominance. Yeah. Oh, I forgive you.
And that's one of the payoffs for holding on to your resentment can be you get the moral high ground, because we love being right. We'd rather be right than happy most of the time. And so having the moral high ground, or being superior in that way, or being right or better than other people, can be very alluring to the ego. And that can be another reason why we don't want to let go of it and do our forgiveness work. It's because we get something out of it. So that can be, in my book, I've written a lot about the payoffs for holding on to our resentment, all the different games that the ego plays, the things that we get out of it, the benefits, all the seeming benefits, because of course when you look a little bit deeper, they're all costs. They're all actually disadvantages to our well-being and who we really are.
How do we actually forgive people? You know, let's say you're, you know, what are the kind of the A to Z instructions in your book?
Well, there's a few things I think that have to happen before you try. And this is one of the things that came up when I was working on the integral presentation, was I think there's like a ladder of readiness for forgiveness. Because if you're at a place at the very bottom of the ladder where you're saying, I'm never going to forgive you for that, like the client that I had recently with the family member who insulted somebody at a wedding, never going to forgive you for that, you're not really going to do any forgiveness work if you can't see past, okay, maybe I should forgive it, or maybe I want to forgive it, or maybe that I've got another wedding coming up and that person's going to be there, so I need to do something so I don't feel quite so full of hate, or that I turn the invitation down. So you need to be at some level of willingness. Having said that, I have worked with clients who've actually said the words, I'm never going to forgive them for that, during the process. And so you don't have to know how, you just have to be willing to forgive. You have to just say, okay, I don't want to carry this around in me anymore. And that's the recognition. And so that there are 7 steps to the process. And I do recommend that people keep a list of the people that you need to forgive, or the things you need to forgive. I've had helicopters on my list before now, because I live in an area where there's helicopters that are buzzing around at night, sometimes it can be intensely irritating. And when I did do my forgiveness process on the helicopters, I have to say I was much less irritated by the helicopters after that. And then back to Jesus with the 70 times 7. If I feel irritated by helicopters at any other time, I'll put it back on my list and do my forgiveness work again. And then I also looked up, who do I need to write to about the helicopters? Because I'm near a Ministry of Defense place, so I could write to them. So that's where you do the action as well as your forgiveness work.
But in fact, actually, you know, you might not have thought of writing that. If you're just wallowing in your feeling of being pissed off at helicopters, that the clarity of that course of action may never have dawned on you, because you haven't got enough freedom and energy to even contemplate how to do anything about it. Too busy gnashing
your teeth. Yeah, and too tired from being so resentful in the middle of the night and feeling angry. Because that's the thing. As soon as you feel angry about something and the resentment is running through your veins, and kind of like holding on to it makes you feel even more resentful, and then you can't sleep at all, which then keeps you awake. So then you hear the helicopters, and
You sound like you're talking from personal experience there.
I am speaking from personal experience. Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing, the irony of, when people say you teach best what you most need to learn. I obviously have been able to hold a lot of resentment, and I've also been willing to let it go. I don't want to carry resentment with me, and so I at the moment, Elon Musk is on my list of people that I need to forgive, because he, ejaculated into my sky all these satellites that I didn't want, and so bits of my sky are moving at night, and I don't want that, and I'm powerless. He didn't ask me whether that was okay. And so, it's like, it's often we resent things where we are powerless, that we have no control. I've got no control over what the Ministry of Defense do over their helicopters. Go on, do you want to add something?
Yeah,
Sorry,
well, I think that's where that serenity prayer comes in, isn't it? You pass out the things that really you are beyond your control.
Yeah.
And then the only sane course of action there is to just forgive the damn thing.
Yeah.
And move on with your life and work on the things you can actually
do.
So you say it's a seven-step process.
7 steps.
So step number 1 is to actually be willing to forgive then.
Well, that's a pre-step. The willingness to forgive.
Step 0.
Step 0 is being willing, and the funny thing is like the only people who I do work with are people who are either at one of the retreats, and it's included in part of what you do on the retreat, or you've come to a session, so you're going to be doing forgiveness work usually, or you might have been sent by a fellow therapist who will send you to me if you need to do some forgiveness work. So it is a very specific thing that you may not have done in any other kind of therapy. So that I think a willingness, or at least knowing that you're going to a forgiveness session, helps. And then the way I work with people is I get them to do the process as an imaginary conversation. And so you do the whole thing with your eyes closed, and you're going through the different steps as if it's a guided visualization. And on my website, if you just do forgivenessmadeeasy.co.uk and then do /book bonus, there's a recording of me taking you through the steps, an MP3 of me, so you can do step 1, so I'll tell you what to do, and then you can pause it, and you can speak out loud, do your part, and then undo the pause, and then keep going, and that will take you through the steps. So you can do it that way, and once you know what the steps roughly are, you can just do it by yourself, walking around the woods, or on a long drive, as long as you're paying attention but don't close your eyes. So it's like, so there's ways of doing it even in sort of waking consciousness. But if it's something very specific, and particularly if it involves trauma, and if it involves early material from your childhood, I would really recommend that you work with a therapist. I would never recommend that somebody who'd been abused, for example, would work on their own. But you can use it for everyday things. So so Elon Musk, or helicopters, or the daily irritations of life, you can use the process for that. And so the very first step is to make eye contact. So it's basically you're just doing eye to eye. So you're making eye contact with the person in your imagination. And I try and set it up similar to in the journey, Brandon Bay's journey work, where you use a campfire. When I first did forgiveness work, I had like a lovely wingback chair, green wingback chair, and a fireplace. And there's something about having the presence of fire there in your imagination, because it's a metaphor for transformation. So it also means that you can let things go, like your resentment and any patterns and pain can go into the fire. So that's the very first step, is just to invite the person that you want to forgive to the fire and make eye contact with them. Shall I keep going?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then the second step is you talk heart to heart. So this would be the part that has a resonance with the Catholic sense of confession. So you would confess the full extent of your resentment, and that really means that you get the chance to say everything you need to say to them that you would probably never say to them to their face, because they wouldn't want to sit there long enough for you to say it. But also you get to say all the things that you're ashamed of. And one of the things I write about in my book is my epiphany about forgiveness came around my relationship with my mother. And it's slightly unusual, because she was ill with multiple sclerosis. And that really, from the age when I was about 15, that had a massive impact on my family and on her well-being and me becoming her carer. So by the time I was 20, I took a year off my university course to look after her as her carer. And so my relationship with forgiveness was about acknowledging and admitting that I had resented my mum for being ill.
Yeah, that, I mean,
Again,
forgiving somebody for having a horrible illness that ends up killing them,
yeah,
is, you know, that's like, I can see that that's a very, very awkward and difficult thing to wrestle with in yourself, isn't it? Because
exactly.
it's nobody, it's not, it wasn't her fault she got ill,
Yep.
but it also did impact your life in a bad way, and it's, but then your feelings not being rational, you know, so many of our feelings, you know, don't kind of take into account all of those perspectives, you know.
Yeah,
And it's just
exactly.
like, oh, my mum screwed my life up because she got ill. But,
Yeah, exactly. And all the things that I didn't get, you know, and then because we don't really know what to do in it, and there's often grief included. So I wasn't really grieving the relationship with her and what I was losing. She was ill for a really long time before she died. So she was sick for until I was 30. So for 15 years, that was a dominant experience in my household. Her illness had such a massive impact on my brother in particular, and my sister as well, and my dad, you know. So, and you don't really want to admit that you resent somebody for that. And it's like when people die, we resent people for dying. Because it changes the dynamic. We resent them if they commit suicide, but we don't admit that because how could we? And was it our fault? And was there something we could have said? And it's very complex. And so one of the other things that I think is important about my book is that I'm saying we resent things that we don't even want to admit that we resent. And I don't know if you're aware of that. I can't remember what it's called. There's something or other window, it begins with J, but the window of things that we're not aware of and that we are aware of.
oh, the Overton window.
I can't remember what this is. I think it's
Yeah.
the Jansen window or something. I can't remember. I have to look it up. But it's basically we're aware of things that other people are also aware of. You know, like you're wearing a grey top. Then there's things that I'm aware of, but you're not aware of. They're things I haven't told you. Then there's the things that you're aware of that I'm not aware of. So I might have a twitch that I'm not conscious of, but you can see it. And then there's the things that I'm not aware of and you're not aware of, which is the, you know, the what's very hidden. But I think we don't want to admit our own resentments. We don't even want to admit them to ourselves, let alone to another person. And so the opportunity to confess the full extent of your resentment.
This is where it links up with shadow work. Is it that
Exactly.
there are feelings we have which are so distorted, ugly, deformed, irrational, monstrous, even unfair on other people. And you know, thinking of being angry with somebody for being ill, you know, that kind of feeling. I think to have a safe space in the way we relate to ourselves is really important in that respect. That it's like, it's okay, I'm not going to, just because I have, you know, if you imagine we're made up of lots of sub personalities, you know, if we were to use this thing of the blaming somebody for getting ill and, you know, having trouble forgiving them for it, that makes up a tiny part of our actual identity, but it feels so toxic that we worry that if we touch it, it will just, like, some rot will just infect the whole of us. And I think, yeah, I mean, if somebody, that was their stance, they said there's something, I can't even, like, admit it, because they're worried that if they unleash that part of themselves, that's it, they're just going to turn into some horrible, festering, sinful monster. What would be your response to that worry?
I encourage it. I let them, and that's what I do. One of the reasons why it takes 90 minutes to do a process with me is because I will keep saying, is there anything else? And
Mm.
I give you like all these different stems. So when you're talking to the person, you're saying, I resent you for all the times when, I hate you for, I'm angry with you because, I wish, you hurt me when, thank you for. So there may be a whole range of things that need to be said. And so I really encourage them. And even sometimes, if necessary, in their imagination, they feel so angry. I was working with somebody the other day who felt so angry they actually wanted to hurt the person they were speaking to. And so you give permission for that energy, the anger energy, to fully express. And again, that's why you have a fire there. And when I work one-to-one with people, I also give them a mentor, and sometimes we work with a younger you. So it's a bit more complex than the one that I use in the book. But the very simplified version is to encourage people to say what needs to be said. And going back to the Catholic tradition, the confession was you able to say to the priest everything that was in your mind, and all this, you know, the grievances in your heart and all the things that you were ashamed of. And then the priest would sanction, you know, would kind of say, okay, just say these Hail Marys or whatever it is to clear your soul, sort of thing. And so I've kind of drawn from that tradition without having a priest as the emissary, or the you know, the intervention between you and the divine. And you can do it directly, and working with somebody can be very powerful, because if someone is hearing you saying all these things and they're not running away screaming, they're just holding the space, just saying it's okay for you to say those things and to feel those things.
Yeah, I think client confidentiality goes a long way to creating the safe space. And a priest, when you go to confess, confidentiality is an assumption there.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of, yeah. And I think, you know, when you're working with some of these extremely powerful and you know, monstrous parts of ourselves that we think are monstrous, when you unleash that to work on it, you may be temporarily overwhelmed, actually. You know, you might feel like you're being engulfed by shame about having that particular feeling, but it's only going to be temporary. You know, and I think that's probably why a 90-minute session, or several sessions over weeks or years, you know, it's that kind of long-term commitment to doing a work, means that you're not going to be annihilated by.
Yeah. And do you know Jill Bolte Taylor's work? Have you come across her TED
Well,
talks? She does
yeah,
the
yeah,
insight.
yeah, yeah.
Well, she talks about the feelings that run through your veins are chemicals, and they normally only last about 90 seconds
Right.
unless you're feeding them.
Mm.
And so I mean, I feel incredibly lucky to have worked with as many different people as I have. And because when we set the process up, they're talking in their imagination as if they're talking to someone. It's so real in the moment, and they're so engaged that somehow it seems like it doesn't re-traumatize them, really weirdly. Whereas I think talking about something can be re-traumatizing, because you're thinking about it and you're experiencing the actual event again. Whereas when you're talking directly in your imagination to someone to correct what didn't ever get said at the time, including get off me, you know, that like actually letting yourself use your throat to say the things that never got said at the time, can be incredibly healing and powerful, rather than overwhelming. So it's like you hold the space for those things to keep moving rather than keep looping. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it makes me think of an evolutionary process is a sort of has a direction to it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Whereas there's this sort of cyclical thing of, you know, trying to get out of. So what, we're on step 3 there, is that?
Yes. So eye to eye, heart to heart, then shoe to shoe, where you then, after you've said everything that you need to say, and that is the longest part of the process. So, and I do keep going, is there anything else? And then I say, check your back pockets, and is there anything else? So that you really feel like you have the chance to say everything that you didn't have the opportunity to say, and might never say anyway in real life. Because also often our resentments are about us. I used to resent my mum for wearing pop socks. but I said it because I did,
Yeah.
and so it's like, it's not, none of it's rational, and it's not really about the other person, but it's for you to just own. And then when you said everything, the next step is shoe to shoe, where you actually swap positions with the other person. You step into their shoes, they step into yours, and you let yourself respond as them. And there's two levels that this works on. So sometimes there's the when you do that first switch, sometimes they go, I didn't realize that was so hurtful to you, and I'm really sorry. Sometimes they go, don't give me that lip, how dare you be so rude. And so you're kind of like, you're allowing whatever the response is, the genuine response from the other person, before you then go back. So there might be a bit of interchange between the two of you, just like in Ken Wilber's Shadow, the 3-2-1 process. You are doing that. This is, what I also stole from. So you're going backwards and forwards between the two. And
he stole it from someone else.
Exactly. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants. And then you go up higher. So you do the William Ury move and you go to the balcony. And then you're able to, and when I do this with my clients, I get their mentors, because it's a bit more complex, to take them up. So like in Scrooge, like in the Ghosts of Past, Present, and Future, help you to look down on your life and see the damage you did, the mess you created, and take responsibility for it. And so you've got the other person and you both looking down at the balcony, from the balcony at the scene. And then you're able to take a higher, wider perspective. And that can be very helpful. Because given, like sometimes when I do that with my clients, they go, oh, they haven't got a higher self, or, they're still arguing with me. In which case I just say, well, just keep going higher, so you just have to keep going. And sometimes you have to transcend the personality pretty much altogether in order to be able to do that particular thing. But eventually, what normally happens, pretty much without exception, is the other person will be apologizing in some form or the other, or they're getting a sense that the other person really gets the damage they did or the pain they caused, or they can see things clearly and take responsibility for what they did and didn't do. And also from that perspective, the client is also able then to see, well, maybe it was to do with the fact that my mum was abused when she was a girl, or my dad was sent to boarding school, or, like you have a kind of more of a bigger picture on why the person who you've been resenting has been behaving the way they have. Does that make sense so far?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
It's good. It's really good.
Yeah, thanks. It took me, I honestly, this feels like, the more I talk about it, the more I know how, it's almost like it's so important that we do this work. And it's almost like there's a million places to, go wrong. And there are ways of making it easier on us, which is what my passion is about, like what can help us to get there. And just seeing the shifts that people make.
The spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. That's you're always refining the sugar. So.
Yeah, exactly. And and every single time I do a session with a client, I get better at doing it, and then I learn more things about what does and what doesn't work. And also, having worked on the retreats where there would be several of us working with one client, we would then be able to feedback, like what worked, how far have they got with their process, and how much further can we take them in their next steps. So it's
interesting that these are on the detox retreats you do. Yeah. So they're, I like that it's a physical detox. They're doing juicing, colonics, all of that stuff, but they're also doing emotional detox. This is very much a detox on the emotional level, isn't it?
Very much. And people often come because they want to lose weight, but actually it's the weight in their hearts that they actually end up losing, and they had no clue that was why they were coming. But they're realizing that there's a relationship between them holding the weight and they're holding the resentment. So, and it is, traditionally proper spiritual retreats would involve fasting, internal shadow work, and cleansing of that sort of intense nature. It's not for the faint-hearted by any means, but it's very profound. And our little strap line is 1 week to change your life, and people genuinely say they did. And a lot of it is to do with the forgiveness work that they do. I remember one client who she was in her 70s and she'd been sexually abused as a teenager, and she said all that bad feeling that I was carrying around with me every day, gone. Amazing. Amazing.
So what step are we on now?
So we're on 4. So eye to eye, heart to heart, shoe to shoe, go to the balcony. So we've like they've looked at the bigger picture. So the next step is 5, which is where you confess the full, not the full extent, your payoffs and your costs. So you're looking at, why have I been holding on to my resentment, and what has it cost me? And this is kind of optional. So often what happens when I work with my clients is we'll get to the point where they've been to the balcony, and then I'd say, "You willing to forgive them?" And they go, and at that point I go, well, that's a no. And so, but let's look at why you've been holding the resentment. And this is the bit that it gets very interesting. So you're kind of looking at, why am I holding onto my resentment? What have I been getting out of it? Why am I not just going, yeah, okay, I see that they were doing the best they could, or, they didn't mean it, or blah, blah, blah. Why am I not able to just, let it go? Why am I still holding on? What's my hesitation? And so you're looking at the payoffs for holding on to the resentment, which, like we've already kind of discussed, things like protection, feels like power. It can be the moral high ground. It can be even things like telling a story to yourself, like, well, you see, my mum was ill when I was a girl, so you can't really expect me to blah, blah, blah. You use it as an excuse to not fully reach your potential, or a victim story, or justifying, well, my boss, no wonder I steal the stationery. I mean, she's such a cow. That kind of thing. So you then use it as an excuse. But then you look at, what's the downside? So when I do that thing and I take the stationery that's not mine, I'm compromising my integrity. I'm not being who I really want to be. I'm not free. If I'm running a martyr story, I'm not in my power. So it's actually robbing me of my power. If I'm resenting somebody, it's in my body. So it's costing me in my physical health. It's costing me in my peace of mind. I'm not sleeping very well at the moment, and I really hate my husband. I wonder if there's a relationship, between those two things, so it's like, so you're always looking at, what is it that's the downside of carrying the resentment, of having the poison in my veins. The stones are in my shoes. I'm the one who's crippled and hobbling along. They're just like off doing whatever they want to do. So sometimes you want to look at what the payoffs are and what the costs are, and then you tell them to the other person, because that's a part of your resentment. So that's it's kind of an optional part, and but it can be really the bit that shifts. And sometimes, again, when I'm working with people in a live situation, not now because of COVID, but before that, I used to pile people up with cushions. So, or maybe their suitcase, and and so they'd have like lots of different things all kind of like piled up, so that they were holding on to their resentment. And then I'd say, are you willing to let it go? And at that point they'd be going, yes, please let me let it go, because they feel the weight of it, whereas before they weren't conscious of what it was costing them. So that's the 5th one. And then the 6th is to do your forgiveness part. So there's an exchange. And again, back to my Catholic inheritance, the vow, there's something really powerful about repeat after me. When you got married, there were words that were said, there were gestures, and then somehow something's different. You're man and wife. You've just said stuff, you repeat after me, but there's something about having it as a ritual and having that sincerity in the exchange. And so I have quite a long spiel that I say that I do as a repeat after me. So, like, even though I may not understand what you did or why you did it, I choose to completely and utterly forgive you. So there's things so I do a repeat after me that's quite long. And that is so that that you've done the forgiveness bit. And I even say the words, and I forgive you, twice, in case you missed it the first time we do it. So you have the chance to actually say it twice. And that's the sort of the gesture of forgiveness. And then there's, if necessary, there's a sense of letting go of your resentment. So you can imagine yourself putting your resentment in the fire, letting go of any kind of old relation patterns of relating. Sometimes, I get the mentor, if I have a mentor in there, removing any, like between the chakras, any energies that shouldn't be there, that kind of thing. So you can do lots of things in your imagination, and it may be like, as a child, if you felt like someone had taken something from you, you could imagine them giving it back. When I work with my clients, I also do like give them a magic potion of resourceful states and stuff like that. But that's kind of like more complicated. But with just this particular step, it's the gesture of forgiveness and saying the words out loud and hearing yourself say them. It's very powerful. Sometimes people genuinely weep at that point.
Yeah, I think there's actually saying something out loud. There's biological reasons why that's actually an important step.
Yeah, and that's
to
partly
take.
why I do the whole process. The whole Forgiveness Made Easy process is done out loud. You're speaking out loud to the person, and they're replying back. You're using your voice the whole time, and more than writing. Writing can be really powerful as well, but there's something even more powerful, I think, about using your voice. So, but I'm very much in favor of whatever works. Like if my forgiveness process doesn't work, then don't use it. You do something else. As long as you find what works for you.
So where in it? Are we at step 7 yet?
Yeah, nearly there. So
that was step 6.
6 is the exchange of words, and then 7 is the completion. So it may be that there's other things that you then say, and I'm going to take you to court, or I'm going to get the law changed about this. So there may be something that like, or I'm going to set up a charity for victims of the abuse that I suffered. So it's like, there may be something that you want to say to the person, like, I'm going forward. And if they're still in your life, it could be, from now on, I'm going to treat you with more love, or I'm going to be more understanding, or my intention is, so there may be something that you want to do differently as a result of your forgiveness work. So that's the 7th step, which is going forward.
Yeah, it's really comprehensive.
Yeah,
I like it.
And it takes 90 minutes, but then it's like, but then you get free. I mean, you genuinely can get free in 90 minutes. And then sometimes, and I write about this in the book, you might do a forgiveness process on somebody. And I give this example of this woman that I met who lived locally, and we were at the same dance class. And a friend of mine was saying, oh, you should get on really well, and I'm sure you'll really, become friends. And I was like, I don't know, don't really get her. And I just said, well, maybe we could lift share. And she went, no, I'd rather be on my own. All right. And so then I went home, did my forgiveness work. And then a few days later, I met her in the health food shop, and she went, and I was in a bit of a rush. I said, oh, can I just quickly push in? And she went, ooh, go on then. And I was just like, I've just done my forgiveness work. And so I went home and did my forgiveness work again. And then we're now really good friends. So it's kind of like, she was proof of, like, if you keep doing your 70 times 7, like, I didn't want to hold resentment against her, because she was like a friend of a friend, and and it just turned out that we actually did become really good friends. But I don't know if we would if I hadn't done my forgiveness work. So
yeah, I'd written down some things that are difficult things for us to forgive, and some of them seem so, they're almost taboo. One, I've written down the environmental crisis, that can, on an individual level, or maybe even collectively, well, both of those, in fact, can we forgive humanity and ourselves for possibly destroying the planet we're living on? Wow. That's a big one.
That is a big one.
And there's so much resentment out there, and a real feeling that it is unforgivable. And then there's this whole thing coming up about current the younger generations. Are they able to forgive the boomers, for
apparently not,
for destroying the planet, with their booming industry after World War II and all of that stuff. And that's I think the way I can forgive humanity and myself for being part of this destructive thing, you know, where we're possibly destroying our planet, is we as humans, we are where we are in terms of the evolution of our consciousness. And so I think somebody was saying, where they go around giving lectures around the world, and they said, what age do you feel humanity is collectively? And most people say kind of adolescent is what, you know, the world population taken as a whole of humanity feels like. And I that kind of resonates with me. And I think, well, I was an adolescent myself. Did so many stupid things. I mean, the thing about being an adolescent is you think you're way more accomplished and knowledgeable and wise and everything than you actually are, and engaging in all sorts of destructive behavior. You know, you treat your body like crap, and men and boys and girls treat each other like crap, and you don't really care about society, you know, other people, other old people, for example, are just annoying. I don't know. It's just that. So I mean, I could do a cognitive thing there where I'm kind of saying, well, I can let humanity off the hook because, you know, they're just morally and intellectually not at the level where they could care about the planet, you know. But I also, because I've got children myself, and I can see how they act against their own interests because of the development of where they are as people. I've got this kind of emotional understanding that when I see my boys fighting over something utterly ridiculous and just ruining their whole day, it's a bit like polluting their own world, you know, but they're polluting their own day for each other over something totally ridiculous. I don't blame them really, because they're just who they are. They're at the state, the cognitive and emotional developmental stage they're at, and I can feel that on that level as a parent. I feel that way about my own children, and can I feel that way about myself and humanity at large?
Yeah. It's a really good question, actually, Ralph, because it's like it's one of the biggest things. And, you know, and Greta Thunberg has said, you know, if you don't do something about it, we will never forgive you. But it's like, so the question really to ask is, how will not forgiving help? Because not forgiving is like going,
Yeah.
I refuse to forgive. That isn't going to help. You know, like changing our behavior is going to help. You know, choosing to make different choices, to be as aware as we can be with the intelligences that we have. And, you know, and we are so, I mean, human beings are so manipulable. I mean, we really genuinely are. If you put chocolate bars by the checkout, we'll buy them because we see them and we want them. We're that easy to manipulate, and we're being manipulated all the time, especially now with the, you know, with social media and the amount that we're now engaged with our electronic devices, you know, our 5-screen lives. I mean, we are utterly hypnotized. And that makes it worse, because we're not hypnotized to make the right choices. We're hypnotized to make the wrong choices. And so it's almost like we're trying to go against the stream, just like you said, you know, the level of development that humanity is at is fairly basic. And we want what we want, and we want it now. And even, you know, even more so now that we actually can press a button and it'll arrive, you know, either later that evening or the next day. So it's our, you know, immediate sense of, you know, gratification gets gratified, and that's addictive. And what we need to be doing is making long-term choices. And in some ways, I think that one of the other reasons why I'm so passionate about forgiveness is it's developing those muscles in us that we don't even know where they are. And like mindfulness, like meditation practice, like choosing things for the longer term, It's an unfamiliar thing that I think without it, we have no future. There's a Desmond Tutu quote, which is, without forgiveness, there really is no future. And it's like, we need to settle our differences so that we can come together and create the world the way we need to. And there's a really great William Ury quote where he says, to begin with, if you'd said it was internal work that was going to resolve the global conflicts, he would have thought you were just like a naive hippie. But now he says he knows that it isn't going to happen unless we do both. We have to do our internal work, and also we need to make the changes in the global arena. So I think it's both and. Resentment isn't going to help us. Forgiveness might.
Yeah, it's a weird, dangerous time we live in with polarization due to social media. I mean, have you seen The Social Dilemma, that documentary?
Yes.
Yeah. And it's kind of making forgiveness harder. And then also the internet doesn't forget anything. So everything you've done, like before the internet, someone could do something, and then over time people forget about it, and then they're just sort of, through the grace of time, they're just forgiven, because it just loses its momentum. But everything you've ever done is on the internet, and you can't erase it. It's just there. It's true. In our faces for all time. Yeah. Well, thanks, Barbara.
Such a pleasure.
It's a very deep and nuanced subject, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, it's like, you could, we've just talked for ages about it, and I mean, we could talk for ages more. But in essence, it is just that simple, that forgiveness is really important, and the more things you can forgive in your life, the better your life and everyone else's life is going to be. That's the sort of essence of it. Yeah. But the art of forgiveness is all of everything we've just passed out in this conversation and more. Like so many of these things, the best practices are very, very simple concepts. They're not difficult things to understand. They're just hard to do. Like so many valid and important things in life. Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and I'll stop the recording in a minute, and we can say goodbye like normal people. But so for people to find out more about your stuff, just say the website again.
Yes, the website is forgivenessmadeeasy.co.uk, and Forgiveness Made Easy is available, hopefully, by the time this goes out, in all three formats: audiobook, paperback, and also as an ebook. And I am working on creating a course for it too, and a workbook.
Cool, that's comprehensive. Yeah. Wow, lucky world.
Thanks so much, Ralph.
Okay, thanks, Barbara.